They laughed at the janitor's daughter. Until she brought a 50mm dead machine back to life. Hey Brooks, if you're gonna daydream around that engine, at least try not to look so confused. Investors might think we hired a thinking mop. Laughter erupted in the lab, harsh and high-pitched, bouncing off the sterile white walls like a chain of insults disguised as jokes. Amara Brooks didn't flinch. She kept wiping the bench, her cloth moving in slow, methodical circles, her eyes fixed on the mammoth engine that had sat dead center in the Apex Dynamics test lab for over a decade. A $50 million embarrassment, an industrial relic, and the daily centerpiece of ridicule. They called her Brooks, like it was a curse. Not Amara. Never Amara. Just Brooks, short, detached, dismissive. A janitor. A legacy janitor. Her father had cleaned these same labs before collapsing from stress-induced heart failure 5 feet from the very engine she now stared at every day. That alone would be story enough. But Amara didn't linger in grief. She lingered in silence. Silence was a weapon sharp and slow. She had learned that from watching men like Colin Harrington, the young chief engineer with a degree from MIT, and a god complex from birth, speak with such authority that even facts bent around his tone. Colin leaned on the railing beside the engine, his tailored blazer untouched by the grime of real work. "I'm genuinely curious," he said, half turning toward the others. "Do you think she even knows what those wires do? Or is this just some Cinderella complex wishing herself into relevance?" The others laughed, especially Spencer Grant, the project lead, who pulled out his phone and started filming. "Brooks and the Beast," he said, "coming soon to a WhatsApp group near you." What they didn't know, and what Amara would never volunteer, was that she had spent her childhood underneath old Chevys and military-grade trucks, her legs sticking out from under engines older than any of them. Her grandfather, Elijah Brooks, wasn't just a mechanic. He was the last man the Pentagon called when nothing else worked. He used to say, "Engines don't lie. People do." She never forgot that. Not even now. Around her neck, hidden beneath a faded utility shirt, Amara wore a small metal pendant, a rusted bolt no larger than a knuckle. It was the last bolt she and Elijah had removed together from a military-grade diesel engine before he passed. She'd wrapped it in copper wire herself, not for decoration, but because she believed that memory had weight. And some weight, if you wore it long enough, became armor. Brooks snapped Madison Blake from HR heels, clacking across the concrete, like accusations. "You're not authorized to be near technical equipment. Someone filed a complaint." Her tone was syrupy, but sharp. "We'll need you to sign an acknowledgement this afternoon." Amara simply nodded. She knew the game. A brown girl in coveralls showing curiosity, threat detected. That night in her tiny apartment filled with salvaged tools and a mattress on the floor, Amara sat cross-legged beside a thick binder. It was a printout of the original technical specs for the Apex Omega X1 engine. She had found it in the printer bin 6 months ago, discarded by someone too arrogant to think paper could be dangerous in the wrong or right hands. With a highlighter and a red pen, she tracked anomalies. She mapped every failed consultant suggestion mentioned in passing conversations. She read between lines that were never meant for her. Outside the city hummed with electricity and loneliness. But in her mind, she heard turbines. Not just imagined ones, but real engines, the ones she used to help fix at a base in Nevada, where Elijah once taught young Air Force recruits. Engines spoke. Not in words, but in temperature shifts, in minute vibrations, in breathing patterns only a listener could feel. Her fingers brushed the bolt on her necklace. "Where are you hurting?" she whispered, not to herself, but to the Omega X1. She didn't know it yet, but something was already shifting, something subtle but seismic. The machine that had broken every engineer was waiting. And it wasn't waiting for a man in a suit. "Brooks, could you maybe try cleaning the floor without pretending you're a scientist? This is a lab, not your little garage fantasy." Ethan Jew's voice rang across the room, just loud enough to draw the eyes of the entire team toward Amara. She didn't respond. Her hand moved over the floor buffer like it was any other day, but inside she was calibrating. not equipment perception. Reactions, timings, pressure points. For the past month, the engineers had escalated from casual mockery to open sabotage. Coffee accidentally spilled near her cart every morning. Doors mysteriously locked when she had cleaning assignments. Notes taped to her locker. "Keep out of our lab. Your place is the janitor's closet." Spencer Grant had even created a running joke. Let's call it the Brooks buffer zone. Nothing technical allowed within 10 feet of her. It earned him roaring laughs and silence from HR. But the cruelest part wasn't the jokes. It was the truth she couldn't say out loud, that she understood the Omega X1 better than anyone in that room. She had watched every test cycle, memorized heat maps from discarded reports, overheard enough late-night arguments to piece together the fractured logic behind each failed fix. And now she had her own theory, a risky one. Her chest tightened as she remembered Elijah's old saying, "When a machine speaks, you don't argue with it. You listen with your hands." That bolt on her necklace vibrated slightly when she walked past the machine yesterday. It wasn't real, of course, it was in her head. But to her, that tremor wasn't imagination. It was memory. So that morning, while the lab emptied out for lunch, Amara crossed a line. She stepped beyond the cleaning zone, stood in front of the Omega X1, and gently reached for its main panel, not to touch, but to observe up close. The diagnostic light blinked in a pattern she'd tracked for weeks, but something was different. Fainter. She leaned in, eyes narrowing, whispering almost unconsciously, "You're not failing. You're misread." A hand clapped loudly behind her. Spencer had returned early. "Caught in the act, huh? Planning to steal company secrets with that rag." His phone was out again. "Smile for the camera, Professor Mop. The investors will love this." The next morning, the video was everywhere, circulating in internal chats, posted on private Reddit threads, by interns even laughed about in the executive lounge. "At least our janitorial staff is curious," joked Madison Blake in a meeting. "Shows initiative, just not the right kind." Amara stayed silent, but not passive. She dug deeper. Nights became obsessive. She built a simulation in her apartment using discarded parts from the recycling bay and a salvaged control panel from an old training module. She ran the same voltage inconsistencies described in the lab's logs. When her reconstructed module burned out, she didn't flinch. That failure confirmed her theory: the primary sensor loop wasn't broken, it was ignoring anomalies caused by altitude pressure drift. The Omega X1 wasn't wrong. It was misunderstood. But theories meant nothing without evidence. And evidence required access. That's when Melanie Cruz, a quiet IT assistant of Filipino descent, slid into her corner at the cafeteria. "You're not crazy," she said softly, her tray untouched. "I've been watching the lab logs. Someone's been mislabeling the engine error reports on purpose." She handed Amara a USB stick. "There's a pattern. But you didn't get this from me." Amara stared at her in disbelief. For the first time in 2 years, someone believed her without question. And more importantly, someone was helping her fight back. That night, Amara returned to the engine. Just past midnight, when the security guards were used to her late cleaning shifts, she crouched near the diagnostics panel, pulling out a small flash drive designed to intercept real-time sensor feedback. Her hands trembled. If caught, she could be fired or worse, accused of sabotage. But she moved forward anyway. Because sometimes you didn't need permission to tell the truth. You just needed proof. The screen flickered. Then something happened that hadn't occurred in a decade. The engine blinked. Once. A single faint pulse. Amara's breath caught. Not because it worked, but because for the first time it had answered her. And in that instant she knew something else. It wasn't just broken. It was waiting. "You think you're clever, huh? Let's see if the janitor knows what a piston looks like." Colin Harrington's voice cut through the lab like a whip full of arrogant amusement. He pointed at the Omega X1 with the flair of a game show host. Around him, a crowd was forming. Engineers, analysts, interns, all eager to witness the next chapter of what had become Apex's cruelest office entertainment, humiliating Amara Brooks. Amara stood still. Her mop rested against the wall. Her hands were steady, her eyes locked not on the engineers but on the machine. The bolt on her necklace was warm, as if charged with tension. This was not a surprise. It was a culmination. "I'll make it interesting," Spencer Grant chimed in. $50 says she can't identify more than 2 components. I'm generous. She gets 3 guesses. More laughter followed like clockwork. "You're on?" Ethan added, pulling out his wallet. 100 she confuses a valve with a coffee filter. Amara stepped forward. The air shifted. She didn't shout. She didn't blink. 6-cylinder inline pistons, dual intake valves, electronic fuel injection system faulty pressure sensor on line 3. Her voice was soft but surgical. Silence. Thick. Awkward. It was like someone had unplugged the sound system in the middle of a party. Eyes darted around, searching for cues on how to respond. A few nervous chuckles. 1 or 2 scoffs. Spencer scratched his head, visibly uncomfortable. Okay, so she Googled some terms. Beginner's luck. Colin said louder than necessary, the confidence now laced with doubt. Anyone can memorize a few words, but even as he spoke, his fingers twitched near the diagnostic console. What they didn't know was that Amara hadn't just read manuals. She had listened to the engineers, to the failed fixes, to the whispers of the machine itself. For 2 years, she had lived in the lab's blind spots, absorbing patterns no chart could capture. She didn't need guesses. She had data. Internal, embodied, intuitive data. But HR didn't like outliers. That afternoon, Madison Blake approached her with a clipboard and a shallow smile. "Amara, some concerns have been raised. You've been observed interacting with restricted equipment. You understand how that could be misinterpreted, right?" Her voice dripped with performative empathy. "I just need your signature here. It's not disciplinary. It's just protocol." Amara didn't argue. She signed. But inside a fuse lit. That night she reviewed the USB Melanie had given her. It wasn't just engine logs. It was a cover-up, a pattern of data manipulation dating back 8 years, errors recoded as external anomalies, sensor overrides masked by firmware patches. And all of it led back to one name, Colin Harrington, the same man who now claimed Amara was a liability. Amara wasn't just up against cruelty anymore. She was up against fraud. Back in her apartment, she traced her fingers over the bolt necklace and whispered, "You always said machines tell the truth, Granddad. But what if people rewrite it?" That question became her mission. She began compiling a full timeline, cross-referencing notes, audio snippets, old emails recovered from forgotten print jobs. Her wall filled with sticky notes and string lines like something out of an investigative documentary. She knew she needed one thing now: validation. Not from the engineers, but from someone who remembered Elijah Brooks. That's when she found the name in an old employee logbook from the 1980s, Dr. Lorraine Jacobs, a retired aerospace engineer, former student of Elijah. Occasionally visited Apex as an external consultant. She was due for an internal systems review in 2 weeks. Amara circled the date, because she wasn't just going to diagnose the Omega X1 anymore. She was going to make it speak. "Okay, Brooks, since you're such an expert, how about this solve the engine mystery or leave the lab? For good." Colin Harrington's tone was mocking, but his eyes betrayed tension. The kind of fear that comes when the joke starts turning real. Around them, a semicircle of engineers, assistants, and even 2 executives had formed. Someone had made popcorn. This wasn't a test. It was an ambush disguised as entertainment. But Amara didn't flinch. She looked up from her cart, slowly pulling off her gloves. "You want to bet?" she asked calmly. "Let's make it worth something." A murmur rippled through the room. Spencer Grant grinned. "Ooh, the janitor's growing a spine. All right, here's the deal. If you're right about the Omega X1, we each give you $100. If you're wrong, you never set foot in this lab again. You scrub bathrooms. Period." Amara met his eyes, steady and unblinking. "Deal." A few engineers laughed. Others whispered nervously. Deep down, they were unsure now, Because despite everything, the teasing, the mocking, the status, Amara had done something none of them had. She made the engine react. The moment spread like wildfire. By 2 p.m., half the department had squeezed into the lab. Madison Blake stood by the door with a notepad, pretending it was all just a compliance formality. But Amara noticed the head of systems diagnostics in the back arms folded, watching intently. The stakes were real. As Amara approached the Omega X1, she felt the bolt around her neck brush against her collarbone. She closed her eyes briefly. "You ready, Granddad?" she whispered under her breath. She touched the side panel gently, almost reverently. Then she spoke. "The first failure," she began, "is invisible to the sensors. The secondary cooling loop is clogged, likely with hardened lubricant that never flushed out properly during the last retrofit. It overheats internally, but the system doesn't report it because the diagnostics only track the primary loop." Gasps. She moved swiftly, walking to the rear housing. "Second failure, this valve. It's calibrated for sea level pressure, but we're 600 meters above that. The readings are skewed. The engine thinks it's failing. It's not. It's being misread." Silence. Amara turned toward the control console and pointed at a blinking light. "Third issue, the monitoring software. You installed a new system last year, but you didn't update the firmware protocols to match the Omega X1's original architecture. So every time the engine signals something outside modern parameters, the system flags it as a fatal error." Spencer Grant chuckled nervously. "That's impossible. We checked those systems dozens of times. You checked using updated manuals," Amara said, not unkindly. "My grandfather always said, manuals teach you general truths. Engines reveal their own truths if you listen." Just then, a calm but commanding voice echoed from the doorway. "Who taught you to speak like that?" Everyone turned. Dr. Lorraine Jacobs had arrived earlier than expected. She stepped forward, silver-haired, steady-eyed, leaning slightly on a cane, but carrying the presence of someone who had taught half the aerospace industry how to think. Amara straightened. "Elijah Brooks, ma'am. My grandfather." Lorraine paused, her expression shifting. "Elijah. As in the Elijah Brooks, yes, ma'am." The old engineer smiled softly. "He once diagnosed a fighter jet failure with just a wrench and a notebook. I've never forgotten that day." Colin's face had drained of color. Dr. Jacobs looked around the room. "Let her try. I'll monitor the data." Colin stepped forward, still trying to assert control. "This is highly irregular." No, Lorraine interrupted her tone, icy. "What's irregular is that a department with a multi-million-dollar budget hasn't fixed this machine in 10 years. If this young woman sees something you don't, maybe it's because she sees what you refuse to." Amara nodded gratefully and turned to the console. Her hands moved across the controls with a familiarity that made several engineers visibly uncomfortable. She adjusted the sensor parameters, bypassed a faulty loop, realigned the valve's input code. Lorraine called out from the diagnostics screen. "Temperatures dropping, pressure normalizing, outputs stable." No one spoke. Spencer took a slow step back. Then Amara pressed the ignition. The Omega X1 roared to life. Not a sputter, not a warning light. A steady, deep hum like the machine was breathing for the first time in a decade. And just like that, the air shifted again. But this time it wasn't tension. It was reverence. "She made it run." The words escaped Colin's mouth barely above a whisper, but the disbelief in his voice echoed louder than the roaring engine itself. Every screen in the room was blinking green. Stable pressure, normalized output, 0 error flags. The Omega X1 wasn't just alive, it was perfect. Dr. Lorraine Jacobs stepped back from the diagnostics monitor, her expression a mix of awe and quiet fury. "For 10 years you've treated this engine like a corpse, and today a janitor brought it back to life in 20 minutes. Her eyes scanned the room. "You should all be embarrassed." No one dared to speak. Amara stood quietly near the panel, her fingers still hovering over the ignition switch. The bolt on her necklace felt heavier than usual, as if it had absorbed the weight of every humiliation, every dismissal, every time someone looked at her and saw less. But not today. Today, it shone like a badge. Madison Blake fumbled with her clipboard, trying to regain some sense of authority. We'll, open an internal review. This incident will be no Dr. Jacobs cut in sharply. This isn't an incident. This is a reckoning. She turned to Amara. You have a voice, Miss Brooks. You've earned it. What do you want to say? Amara looked around at the engineers who had once laughed, mocked, dismissed her. She could have thrown their words back at them. She could have demanded apologies, resignations, justice. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped forward and said, This machine never stopped working. You just stopped listening. You believed your degrees, your positions, your salaries gave you the full truth. But engines don't care about status. They only respond to attention, respect, observation. The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was humbling. Lorraine nodded. Well said. But not everyone was ready to accept defeat. From the back of the room, Ethan Jew crossed his arms. This doesn't prove she's qualified. She doesn't have certification. She bypassed security. She accessed restricted systems. That's a violation, Spencer chimed in. Yeah, and let's not forget she was snooping around on off hours. That USB she used, where did it come from? A different kind of tension started to rise, one laced with desperation. Amara's gaze didn't waver. You're right. I did dig deeper. And in doing so, I found more than technical errors. She reached into her bag and pulled out a file, a printed log of system edits email chains, maintenance record inconsistencies, and sensor overrides. She handed it to Lorraine. The problem wasn't just with the machine. It was with the people managing it. Data was altered, errors relabeled, contracts extended based on false diagnostics, millions in consulting fees wasted. Colin stepped forward, eyes wide. You're accusing us of fraud. Now I'm not accusing, Amara said calmly. I'm reporting. Lorraine flipped through the pages, her frown deepening. This is serious. It's the reason you were called back in for this review, wasn't it? Amara asked. The board knew something didn't add up. Spencer tried to speak, but Lorraine raised a hand. Enough. She turned to the room. Effective immediately, I'll be initiating a full audit. Every decision made about this project for the past 10 years will be reviewed. Every name attached to a failure will be re-examined. Madison backed toward the door. I need to make some calls. Lorraine's voice stopped her cold. You'll do that after your debrief with compliance. Meanwhile, the engine continued to hum in the background, a mechanical anthem to the truth. Amara exhaled slowly the years of silence, finally giving way to clarity. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. I didn't come here to humiliate anyone, she said. But I also won't apologize for doing what you all failed to do. Listen. The words landed like a verdict. Then Lorraine turned to her. Miss Brooks, what's your next step? Amara hesitated, and then smiled. I think it's time to rewrite the manual. You saved the company $3 million. On your first unofficial day, the voice belonged to Victor Crane, Director of Engineering Strategy at Orion Aerospace, standing tall in a tailored charcoal suit as he addressed Amara across a polished conference table. A week had passed since the Omega X1 had roared back to life, but its echoes were still shaking the industry. Word had spread faster than anyone anticipated. Behind him, Lorraine Jacobs smiled proudly. She had personally introduced Amara to the board, and within days, the same girl who once mopped oil stains was now being offered a senior consulting contract to lead Orion's new diagnostics division. Amara nodded politely, but something in her gaze lingered. She was grateful, no doubt. But part of her was still back in the dusty lab, surrounded by men who had spent years treating her like background noise. Crane continued. You won us over with one demonstration. But what impressed me most wasn't your technical precision, it was your clarity. You see systems like living things. That's not just skill, Amara. That's vision. It should have felt like a victory. But that night, as she sat alone in her small apartment, same creaky floorboards, same smell of engine grease. She stared at her grandfather's old toolbox untouched since his passing. The bolt necklace he gave her years ago now rested on the coffee table beside her new employee ID. Amara turned it over in her hand. How do you celebrate something that feels both earned and too late? The next morning she returned to Apex for a final debrief. As she walked through the halls, employees who once ignored her now offered tight-lipped nods or quick glances of forced respect. No one said it aloud, but they all knew the hierarchy had been rewritten. Colin Harrington's office door was open. Empty. A memo taped inside confirmed his immediate administrative leave pending review. In the break room, Melanie Cruz caught up with her. They're scared, Melanie whispered. Not just because you were right, but because now they have no excuse. You showed what happens when someone listens, learns, and speaks up. Amara smiled. Then let them be scared. But not everyone was bitter. Lorraine had arranged for a private lunch off-site. There she handed Amara a leather-bound notebook, old worn with faded pages. Elijah gave me this decades ago, Lorraine said. He told me to pass it on when I met someone who actually understood machines, not just programmed them. He said you'd know what to do with it. Amara opened it. Her grandfather's handwriting filled every corner, notes, sketches, equations, and thoughts like poetry. An engine doesn't lie, but it can lose its voice. Her hands trembled. For a moment she wasn't in a corporate meeting or a high-tech boardroom. She was 12 again, knees dusty in the garage watching Elijah explain combustion like it was storytelling. She looked up, eyes misted. I don't just want to fix engines, she whispered. I want to fix how we see the people who do. Lorraine nodded. Then start with Orion. They need someone like you. The industry does. That night, Amara accepted the offer. But before she submitted her paperwork, she made one request I want to mentor. Internships, apprenticeships, for people with skill but no degree. No more locked doors. Crane didn't hesitate. Done. As she left the building, Amara passed by Apex's old lab. It was being renovated, stripped down to its frame. She paused, letting one hand touch the frame of the door, then walked on. The machine had spoken. Now it was her turn. Is this the girl who fixed a $50 million engine using nothing but instinct and heart? The question came from a late-night news anchor, her voice echoing through living rooms across America. Amara Brooks was no longer a whisper in the hallway. She was a headline. Over the course of 72 hours, her name flooded social media, trending hashtags like Choo-Choo Engine Whisperer and Brooks Effect, lighting up every platform. Interviews were requested. Universities emailed. Tech giants called. But while the world cheered, Apex Systems unraveled from within. The internal audit ordered by Lorraine Jacobs had begun producing results, and they were damning. Colin Harrington had falsified 3 years' worth of technical efficiency reports. Spencer Grant had signed off on consulting extensions despite negative ROI. Madison Blake's HR emails revealed systemic dismissal of complaints from staff without Ivy League degrees. And Ethan Ju, who once mocked Amara's credentials, had never passed the full certification exam himself. His position was quietly suspended pending verification. Within days, Apex lost 2 major government contracts. Share prices fell. Investors pulled out. And in the center of it all, the ghost of a machine that had sat dormant for 10 years now stood like a monument to the company's arrogance and Amara's triumph. But she didn't smile as it crumbled. Because unlike those who'd ridiculed her, Amara knew justice wasn't just about watching systems fall. It was about building something better in their place. At Orion, her first initiative launched under the name Project Bolt, a reference to the necklace she still wore every day. The bolt, once just a keepsake from her grandfather, now symbolized precision memory and resilience. It became the logo for her diagnostic mentorship program. The twist: she didn't just train engineers, she trained listeners, young people from underfunded schools, veterans with mechanical instincts, but no formal degree. Women who'd been told tech wasn't their thing. She brought them in, sat them around machines, and asked, What do you feel when this starts up? It wasn't science as the industry knew it, but it worked. One of her interns caught a flaw in a prototype drone engine that saved Orion $7.5 million in redesigns. Another proposed a friction reduction technique based on an idea her grandfather had scribbled in the old notebook. By the end of the quarter, Orion's innovation pipeline had tripled. Meanwhile, a camera crew from a major documentary outlet followed Amara for a feature titled From Mop to Mechanic, the Story of Amara Brooks. They captured her visiting her grandfather's old garage, now transformed into a community workshop. She taught classes every Saturday hands-on, no textbooks, just machines and patience. An engine, she told one student, is like a person with trauma. If you rush to fix what's loud, you'll miss what's broken. But the biggest surprise came when a familiar name appeared on her intern applications, Madison Blake. She almost deleted it. But something stopped her. Instead, she invited Madison in for a conversation. They sat across from each other, this time on equal chairs. I didn't know what I didn't know, Madison admitted, hands clenched. And I laughed along with people I should have stood up to. I'm not asking for a job, I just want to learn how to see the way you see. Amara didn't answer right away. Instead, she slid the bolt necklace across the table. Madison looked confused. This, Amara said gently, isn't just a piece of metal. It held everything together when everything else fell apart. If you're willing to learn what it means, you can join the next cohort. Madison nodded, eyes misted. Later that night, Amara stood outside the Orion building, watching the city lights flicker. She thought of Elijah, of the lab, of the laughter that once made her doubt her worth. Now those same voices had gone silent, but a new one had risen, her own. And just as she turned to leave, Lorraine texted, "Call me. A certain university wants you to give the keynote at their engineering symposium. Also, someone wants to meet you. You're the reason I almost quit engineering." The voice was low, gravelly, and came from behind her as Amara stood backstage moments before delivering the keynote at Stanford's Future of Engineering Symposium. She turned slowly and saw him, Colin Harrington. The once proud senior engineer now looked smaller, dressed in a thrift store blazer, eyes shaded with guilt, and something else. Humility. Amara didn't flinch. Colin cleared his throat. "I'm not here to ask forgiveness. I just needed to say, I was wrong. About everything. About you. About what makes someone valuable." There was a pause. Then she answered, quiet but firm. "Respect isn't given because someone admits they were wrong. It's earned by what they choose to do next." He nodded slowly, like a man finally understanding a lesson too long ignored. "I work in a community garage now, teaching kids. Most of them look like you did when you were mopping the floor. You gave me a wake-up call. I'm trying to pass it on." Amara watched him walk away. Not with resentment, but with a bittersweet acceptance. Some ghosts weren't meant to haunt, they were meant to transform. When she stepped on stage minutes later, the crowd fell into complete silence. Hundreds of young engineers, professors, tech leaders, and in the front row, Lorraine Jacobs, her former mentor. And beside her, a surprise. A gray-haired man with weathered hands. Thomas Reed. He offered a proud nod. Amara took a deep breath. "I was told once that engines don't lie. But people do. People lie when they say you don't belong. When they laugh because you learn differently. When they act like your skin or silence is proof of ignorance. But machines respond to one thing: attention." She lifted her necklace, the bolt gleaming under the stage lights. "This," she continued, "isn't a symbol of rage or revenge. It's a reminder that even the smallest piece, when understood and placed right, can hold everything together." The audience leaned in. "So today I ask you not to become better engineers, but better listeners, better humans, because what we build doesn't matter unless it also builds us back." A standing ovation rose like a wave. Later that evening, Amara visited Elijah's grave. The sunset painted the sky in amber and violet. She knelt down, placed the bolt necklace on the stone, and whispered, "We did it." Back at Orion, the mentorship program had grown into a nationwide movement. Project Bolt had trained over 300 engineers, many from underrepresented backgrounds. Companies began to shift their hiring models, focusing not just on resumes, but on practical intuition, character, and passion. Meanwhile, Amara refused interviews with celebrity talk shows, but made guest appearances in schools and community centers, often with a wrench in hand and grease on her sleeve. The world had changed, but she stayed grounded. One afternoon, as she finished up a lecture, a shy girl named Kiara approached her. "My brother says I can't be an engineer," Kiara said, eyes wide with hesitation. Amara smiled, knelt down, and handed her a tiny chrome bolt. "Tell your brother that engines listen to you, not him." And just like that, the legacy began again, one whisper, one wrench, one student at a time. Because Amara Brooks hadn't just fixed an engine, she had tuned an entire generation to believe again.